Continuamos con el programa del Congreso.
We continue with the Congress.
Asociación Internacional de Profesionales de la Accesibilidad, su implicación preparando y organizando la siguiente mesa redonda.
We have prepared the following roundtable called Relevance of Accessibility in Cultural and Event Facilities. We have Lourdes Arreola, coordinator in IAAP. This program is an international certification that acknowledges the professional know-how in accessibility. Lourdes is advisor for a national program on inclusion, and she has also worked as a speaker in terms of accessibility, inclusion, and diversity in several forums, both international and international. She also belonged to the Mexican committee to develop the TIC standard, among others. Lourdes, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us here. The screen is yours.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Un gusto estar con todos ustedes. Muchas gracias por esta invitación.
You today.
De la Fundación 11.
Thank you so much for being here in the name of ONCE in English, since this roundtable is international. With other participants, thank you for your participation.
To ONCE Foundation for opening this space to talk about the relevance of accessibility for recreational and cultural buildings.
Thank you very much.
The International Association of Accessibility Professionals is a non-for-profit membership-based organization for individuals and organizations that are focused on accessibility.
In English, since this roundtable is
Or are in the process of building their accessibility skills and strategies.
Thank you for your participation.
The objective is to help accessibility professionals develop and advance their careers and to support organizations integrate accessibility into their services, products, and infrastructure. This is a certification that aims to be open for professionals and also for persons with disabilities who need recognition. Today, we would like to talk with you about the relevance of accessibility for recreational and cultural buildings.
Is to help accessibility professionals develop and advance their career.
We are happy to have today with us some members from our organization that we will talk to us about this topic. We have Colette Fransolet from South Africa. Colette works as Universal Access Consultant based in Cape Town with a master's degree in industrial design and a specialization in universal design. Since 2015, Colette has been the South African representative for Smart Cities for All, a global initiative by G3ICT, and she is also an IAAP accredited level 3 expert, certified professional in accessibility built environments. She serves as a board member for Global Universal Design Commissions, a non-for-profit corporation which was established to develop global universal design standards for building, products, and services. We have also on this table Mr. Joseph Kwan. Dr. Joseph Kwan is an architect and an accessibility consultant, founder and managing director of UDA Consultants, Universal Design and Accessibility Consultants in Hong Kong since 2005. He has 45 years of experience in international architectural practice, having worked in Australia, United Kingdom, France, and now over 30 years in Hong Kong. He has been the director of a Hong Kong NGO specializing in accessible built environments and transportation for 18 years. He's also a member of the board of IAAP for built environment. And we have also with us Subhash Chandra Vashishth. He is from India. Subhash is an accessibility, universal design and diversity inclusion specialist and a lawyer focusing on disability rights. He's also a blogger with an interest in inclusive mobility, transportation, inclusive sanitation, walkability, smart cities, and livable habitats. As an advocate, Subhash litigates in the High Court of Delhi and Supreme Court of India. He's co-founder and director of Center for Accessibility in Built Environment Foundation, open and based in New Delhi, India. Subhash is also a member of the Built Environment Task Force with IAAP. So I would like to thank all of you for being today here to talk about this important topic, which is the accessibility of recreational and cultural blindness, because everyone has the right to travel, to visit museums, to go to a concert. Nevertheless, do we have the accessibility required for that? So Colette, please, the microphone goes to you.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. Thank you for having us here. It's an honor to start off the discussion with some colleagues that I know very well from some work in the built environment. And so I think for me, if we consider the basis of equality legislation, so not only in South Africa, but internationally, the emphasis on accessibility is in terms of movement, education, economic activities, political contribution and representation, safety and health, as well as social and cultural activities. So that essentially speaks to the pertinence of accessibility to both recreational and cultural buildings to contribute to a holistic life. And so in South Africa, we have a rich cultural history, which is marred by previous regimes of segregation. Whilst everybody's working really hard to uphold democracy in a currently unstable economic climate, it puts great focus on the ability of all people, local and international, to be able to not only access, but also to enjoy our cultural buildings, to learn about the complexities in which we live. And so our cultural sites, like those around the world, are of historical value. And so additional permissions and restrictions apply when accessibility has to be achieved. We have found through our work that there's only one real major barrier to creating accessible heritage sites, and that by and large is the attitude of the people involved in the project. So facades can be retained, aesthetic values can remain intact, but if the people on the project are not wanting to see the facility be made accessible, universal access is greatly compromised. So essentially, where there's a will, there we will find a way. And so once attitudinal barriers are overcome and these buildings then require careful thoughts and planning to preserve the building in its most authentic form, but also to enable access for people who, in our context, buildings were previously designed to discriminate against and exclude. So in some cases, universal access is able to be achieved through the main entrance, for example. Mostly due to conflicting requirements, accessibility is often rerouted to the second entrance. Internal to the buildings, aspects that often lead to inaccessibility are things like lighting, signage, ablution facilities is a big one, and the ability to travel vertically if that's required in the building. These are often the more costly aspects to retrofit at cultural sites, and often where most compromises need to be made. Universal accessibility shall, however, never compromise on the safety of people who it is imperative to serve. And so fire and life safety is a top priority for all people. So where costs are significant, universal design access plans are drawn up, and these eventually result in universal access through a series of reasonable accommodation measures and steps. These can then be budgeted for over time and implemented gradually until all of the aspects are implemented. And it's essential then to maintain a clear, honest and detailed open means of communication with the people who we designed the buildings for. So this means that achieving universal access highlights the importance of staff sensitization in terms of disability awareness raising and training in accessibility, because they're the main point of contact for the people going through the facilities. I think another point I wanted to raise was accessibility to cultural buildings is, however, not only restricted in my context to physical access. Technology can play a massive role in the broader accessibility to these buildings. So having things like off-site digital walkthroughs, videos, tactile maps, 3D models, all go beyond the ability to have to be present in a building to actually experience what that is like. And so we've not applied the virtual reality concepts yet in our country, but given the pressures we've had on the digital space within the last 2 years within COVID, this is bound to be something that we're going to see much more of very soon. So I think my last point before I give over to Joseph to do his piece is that speaking to accessibility, I need to mention the ability to access facilities. So in a country where there are great economic divides like ours, accessibility and the ability to access something are two different aspects. And so low-income populations, due to various reasons, such as travel costs, travel distances, access to knowledge and information, these people are largely not able to access cultural and recreational areas. So this is largely a fault of our previous regimes where people had been divided because of social status and racial segregation. And so having accessible buildings and experiences does not necessarily lead to people being able to access it. And so when we speak to accessibility of recreational and cultural buildings, both forms of access need to be considered. Yeah, so I'm happy to leave that there. Can I hand over to Joseph?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colette. You had made a very important point, right, about both accessibility, right? Like being able to pay, to go there, to have transportation, right? And also, of course, to enter to the buildings, which is one of the topics we are covering today. So thank you so much. So Joseph, please, the micro goes to you.
Okay, thank you. Colette has actually covered a lot of ground. She's raised a number of very interesting topics. I think we spent hours just to talk about the things that she raised. But if I may just focus on a few things for a moment. First of all, I mean, it's human rights, right? To have access to these recreational cultural facilities. I mean, just quick referral to the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article number 9 says accessibility, that we must provide equal access to the physical environment. And then Article 31 basically states that we must provide participation for everybody in cultural, recreational, leisure, and sports facilities as a basic human right. So basically, these are the very high level aspirations, if you like, or guidance that we need to adhere to globally, internationally. So there's no doubt about that. Equality in human rights is very important where we're coming from. In terms of who we're designing for, I think Colette also mentioned, we're designing for a cross-section of people, which are all different, yet we, like they say, it's diverse, yet we must include everybody. Now, of course, that includes people in wheelchairs, people with mobility difficulties, people with hearing impairment, people with vision impairment, and people with intellectual impairment or cognitive impairment. Of course, these are different considerations. As a designer, as an architect, we must consider into how do we translate those qualities into the built environment. What we said, you know, with recreational or cultural, which in effect are quite different. Recreational, I think, is probably, you could say it's playground, it could be sporting, it could be leisure activities. Cultural, to me, is more like museums, art galleries, and quite different, yet much the same. We need to provide access for them. And I think Colette alluded to the fact that we can use ICT or alternative formats into making it accessible, even though some things, if we talk about the third level, the heritage buildings, which may or may not be able to touch too much the built environment, we may have to provide some alternative sort of accessibility, if you like, rather than actual physical access getting into place. So there's this, it's a matrix we're talking about that we need to really consider. And the other side of the thing, the actors in this, the stakeholders in this equation are the building providers. You know, these are probably the public as well as private building providers, which could be government or NGOs providing recreational facilities or museums or sports stadiums, etc. So, and once again, all these actors, we must think of right at the beginning that the important thing is provide equal access to these facilities, including all those people I just mentioned. And I think Colette allude to the fact that maybe universal accessibility is a myth that we can achieve some of these goals. And, you know, from the professional side, I think we really need to probably train and sensitize our planners, our architects, our interior designers, people who are involved in the procurement or building of the built environment, that the way to do that is if universal access, universal design is a concept we should adopt, then we must do that and ensure that by adopting these various concepts, we can make sure the motto is to leave no one behind. And I think that's what we're trying to do. And we talk about inclusion, we talk about diversity, yet bottom line is leave no one behind in the total environment. I think I will stop on that as well. Thank you, Lou.
Thank you so much, Joseph. You also have made great points. Thank you for that. As you mentioned, I think one of the points you just mentioned about procurement on the built environment, right? Usually we focus on architects, we focus on engineers, but we do forget procurement, right, for the built environment. And those persons who are today taking care of the procured environment, built environment, needs to also be aware of accessibility. That's why, as you mentioned, we have like a basic level on how to understand this and at IAAP, and there is many around the world for people just to understand the basics. So for who we are buying or building this recreational space, right? So thank you so much. And now, Subhash, the micro goes to you, please.
Thank you so much for giving this opportunity. I come from India, and in India has a huge, very rich cultural context. We have more than 32 UNESCO recognized World Heritage Sites. And you know, when all these sites were created, they were created in a time when perhaps accessibility was not even thought of. And whenever you created heritage, you would create it on a top of a mountain, or you would build it in such an environment. So you can't really blame the planners of those time or designers of those time, because that was a thought process. Over the years, yes, the thought process has evolved that yes, everybody has a right to access, and human rights regime has played a major role. We have today, most of the countries have signed UN Convention, and their laws are mandating accessibility to all the public monuments and sites. So like anybody else, persons with disabilities also have equal rights to access the cultural heritage. And the importance is, in the past, access to cultural heritage and the tourism was mostly considered as a luxury, given the, again, huge divide like Africa and India too, we have huge divide. And it's almost like a luxury. But thanks to these efforts and thanks to larger awareness, that people feel, no, it's not no more a luxury. It actually adds to the value of life. So the richness in life is through, and also given the situation around the world, there's a lot of stress. Tourism is a huge stress buster. You come out of your, and it leads to a good mental health. So I think the world is realizing that access to heritage has not just educational or these values, but also health benefits, mental health benefits, and of course, right regime is absolutely there. In India, we had this experience of working with these UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which were with the Archaeological Survey of India. But the learnings from these were, so most of these sites, as I said, were built with multiple plinth levels, and we had everywhere stepped access. And there was a very strong resistance by the conservation professionals, because they felt, no, these are a very old heritage and need to be really conserved. And in the process of conserving, most of the time they forget that they also need to be opened up for people to appreciate that this heritage. And we had a long discussions and arguments over it, where it's not, in justifying that it is not conservation versus accessibility, but conservation along with accessibility. And of course, there was earlier little vague policies about which will take precedence, the accessibility or conservation. So that fight has now almost come to an end, where people realize that accessibility is now a mandate, thanks to the disability legislations in most of the countries, also in India, that we have a very firm policy framework in support of accessibility. The only challenge that remains is that we need to strike a balance between the strict conservation norms and the need of accessibility. Another challenge that we keep observing everywhere is access is usually focused on wheelchair users, people with physical disabilities. Other disabilities usually are left out, and that is something that perhaps is the objective in the coming time. Another issue is the sensitization of officials who are implementing these changes and involvement of persons with disabilities, right people with expertise, for example, people who have certification in accessibility, so that they can really appreciate accessibility as a wholesome solution rather than one ad hoc solution. So that is something perhaps we should be looking at intervention as we evolve into a regime where people with disabilities also take a major space. So I think I'll just stop here. Maybe I'll talk in the intervention period of my learnings as well.
Thank you so much, Subhash. You all have made great points. And what you are mentioning about legislation and that legislators needs to understand that conservation goes hand to hand with accessibility is also, I think, a key point, right? It doesn't mean that because you have an heritage building, you cannot build accessibility around it, right? And allow everyone, because as you all mentioned, accessibility is a benefit for all of us around the world, right? We all will become older one day, and we will probably be thankful for having elevators or having easy access to some places that we now like to go, right? So this is a benefit for all, and no one needs to be left behind, as you also mentioned. So now I have a questions for you, and I would like each of you to answer, please, to this question. So the first question is, what are your top first steps, 2 or 3, that you should set to consider when trying to build accessibility within an historical, cultural, recreational building? So Colette, could you share with us your...
Thanks, Lourdes. Yeah, I think there were so many things that both Joseph and Subhash had mentioned that just kind of kickstart these conversations. But I think to get back to your question, I think firstly for me is to consider the entire journey map of users. I think people, it's probably one of the misunderstandings about the concept of universal access is that it looks at the picture as a whole. It's not, yes, we built environment specialists, but we assess the whole system. So it goes through the whole chain. And I think that that's the difference between somebody who has a certification and experience and credibility in the industry, because we're able to look at it holistically. So not necessarily from an experience point of view. So that's where the stakeholders come in, like Subhash had mentioned earlier. But so it's about being able to look at everything objectively, every step of the way, and consider all the different requirements based on the users that Joseph had mentioned earlier. Like, we're designing for a range of people. So that would be my first thing, is the entire journey map. So from where somebody accesses information, how do they buy tickets if they should, knowing about transport and how to get there, orientation at the site. Then you're looking at access and movement through the facility, and then all the way back to their starting point. And this also includes the ability to give feedback. So we might not be able to advise on making online systems accessible, but we definitely can identify where they're inaccessible. And then I would say the second step would be then to prioritize changes based on constraints. So based on budget, based on timeframes, based on the facility's capacity. So I would start there. Those would be my 2 things.
Thank you so much, Colette. Joseph, please.
Thank you. I think that, yes, following on to what Colette has mentioned, the travel chain you mentioned is very important. We say we do a travel chain analysis, or things should be seamless, whether it's from environment to transportation to environment and whatever it is. that journey, as you mentioned. I think we all believe that it should be totally seamless and accessible for everybody, you know. And to me, it's once I like to say that it's the first step, is probably inclusion of all groups I just mentioned. You know, we're designed not just one specific group. Subhash mentioned we're focusing a lot of wheelchair users at the moment. That's why we started, because they most likely have the largest difficulties, because they require certain spaces for maneuverability, and they were the ones who got the highest, the loudest voices, and they were the ones we focus on first. But once again, we need to design something which a visually impaired person can do, a blind person, low vision person can appreciate a museum, an art gallery, that sort of thing. That's where the alternative format comes into play, and how once we identify those various issues, how do we translate those into really accessible features? All right, there's certain needs, translate the needs, those human aspects of that into the physical accessible features, you know, whatever the hardware that is, in other words. And then once again, it was going to be a heritage type buildings where we're talking about your UNESCO sites in India. You know, I do believe that we really should have professionals involved where they could be sensitive, you know, to the heritage aspects, and not just throwing a ramp because you need access. I think there are many, many ways of designing something quite nicely, and without doing something, you know, for the sake of something. And I think you can do very nice to integrate that, whatever it is, into a historical building with all that in mind. And finally, as a quick one, we really should be engaging in consultation with various user groups. You know, it's not professional, it's top down, so we know best. Not even access consultants know best. We need to consult with the stakeholders, which includes the group we're talking about, as well as all the professionals, the two ends, or many facets. We must engage the users with the professionals, and very important that we have, if it's going to be heritage buildings, there's someone really specialized in heritage accessibility. There are very, very few architects and access consultants really specialize in heritage. And I think we need to develop that more skill sets in order to help us into doing something which is sensitive, usable, and user-friendly, and acceptable, aesthetically acceptable for everybody. I think that's my conclusion of that one at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Now, Subhash, if you could share with us also your 2-3 tips for the audience about how to get into this kind of projects.
Yeah, definitely. I think Colette has wonderfully summarized, and so has Joseph, that we are again focusing on trip chain. So are we access to culture is not just buildings. It's a whole process. As I said, the process is mobility from the home, whether the person is able to come out using a white cane or using a battery operated wheelchair or some other equipment or a manual assistance, human assistance, and then use all the transport means, right, from air to taxi and to last mile. Then you reach at that particular place, and that particular place, there are so many agencies. The major issue that we keep facing is the multiple agencies involved in the whole trip chain. And if they don't interact and they are not sensitized, they don't understand the objective, then probably everything fails. Even when the user are talking, because users, stakeholders, they talk from the perspective that they need this. Whereas to provide that, there are so many agencies. So for my step would be at the national level or at a country level, we need an integration or synergy between different departments dealing with different services, in mobility or in the built environment or construction of road or construction of provisions or maybe construction of public toilets or amenities. So you need that synergy and sensitization and training among all the stakeholders. That's one. Second is, we have to be mindful of there are always conservation concerns. What we might think is making it accessible might damage the character of heritage site, because I'm talking from my experience in the country where we are dealing with UNESCO World Heritage Sites, where we don't even put a nail, we don't even put a nail into the building because of the conservation efforts. There are so strong laws. I'm sure across the world they should be very similar. and the suggestions. I mean, we have found if the right people are not involved, the suggestions that come for improving access actually alter the entire character and spoil the aesthetics. So that's why the importance of right people involved, trained people involved, certified people involved in making these suggestions. Of course, we are not saying persons with disabilities are not their roles are not very important, but it would be great if persons with disabilities also get certified and learn, have a wholesome view, and can provide these facilities. Their inputs are definitely welcome, but we also need the importance of trained and certified people who can look at the wholesome view and provide solutions that are sustainable, that are acceptable, and there are no questions raised which keep the character of the built environment safe. I think I would stop at these two major points. These are steps for me.
Thanks a lot, Subhash. Yeah, you're right. I mean, we all know and we all have been in this inclusion and accessibility path for many years now. And as an organization like ONCE and the organization as the IAAP, we have been looking to spread the education around accessibility right through the world, and this is something that is important. We need to professionalize that education, right, to ensure that someone who knows about exactly how to look at this project, and it's not that it's difficult, it's just you need time to understand all different types of disabilities, right? What could require the person or not. That's why we need both, right? Person with or without disabilities on this to solve and to get to have a world more accessible, right? Where everyone can have a seat to look at the theater emission, right, for example. So my next question would be, I would like to ask you to provide us with an example of good practice in ensuring equal participations of persons with disability in recreational and cultural spaces in your country or any other place in the world, because I know all of you have been all around the world. So please provide us with a good example. And now let's say that they're on the other way. So Subhash, could you start, please?
Definitely. See, for me, I can definitely cite from my experiences of the World Heritage Site of Qutub Minar, where I remember having started in 2007-8 when we first initiated the discussions. 2006, yeah, we started discussing, and the best thing was, that time it took a lot of time in cajoling people in sort of counting the benefits of accessibility and how it will impact the overall revenue of the sites, how international tourists will be. Because eventually, that's an argument that you will always raise, that it will lead to more footfall of international tourists. Any tourism agencies will actually sit up and take note, okay, how we can increase more footfalls, how we can increase revenue generation, how we can have more local community participating and benefiting economically from that access improvement. So that's one of the methods that we used in India. So that local community got involved, persons with disabilities got involved into not just analyzing, but also, for example, there is some small canteen or some small stall needs to be put up. Can we give preference to NGOs or persons with disabilities? So they get a livelihood opportunity, and they also are able to showcase their own skills. So it's serving two purposes. One is there is a larger awareness in the community that people are skilled, people have skills, and they can be on their own. They don't need to be always on the government's arms or government funding. And so this is one. Other is that people can also be involved in user testing. So right from the planning stage and to during the implementation and also post-implementation, so that the accessibility is, as we say, it's not a one-time affair. It's a continuous process. So accessibility has to be maintained throughout the life of the product or life of the property. So the role of users definitely comes in there. And these good experiences that we have in India, where we involve persons with disabilities and for conducting access audits as a part of access auditors group as stakeholders, where they're going with their own and explaining their experiences and how it could be done, what are their needs. So this really helps in taking a wholesome view and also sensitizes people, because we always ensure, so whenever we have these kind of audits, the conservationists or people from this Archaeological Survey of India or other officials from the tourism sector are a part of the team. They're also taking a study visit together. So this really, I mean, these are some good practices that I can share from my experiences.
Thanks, Subhash. Joseph, could you share with us a good practice, please?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'd probably like to share a couple of examples, which I'm actually working on at the moment. It's a fairly large sporting complex, involves about 3 different stadiums. And we realized that because it's such a huge infrastructure project, that I think, first of all, we need to have the political will. It's very important, political will to take things on. If we lack that, it's very, very hard to push from any angle. So I think we need to convince, as Subhash mentioned, that we need the people at the top to be involved, political will to do things. And then we involve various stakeholders. Of course, the one you mentioned is participation of people with disabilities. And this particular project, during the design stage, we certainly engage with a number of the NGOs at various levels into engagements in asking them what their views and opinions were of those particular features or the facilities provided. And from then, we take it up to the next level, where we look at that type of building from 2 points of view. One is what we call a general admission, from people coming in from, if you like, front of house or something like that. Another way to look at it is people coming in, how would they use that particular building or the stadium with the various abilities or disabilities. And then the other side of that, the people actually will be using it are most likely this area are the sports person. You know, as a sports person with disability, how is he or she will come into that stadium and use the back of house, like a showering and changing rooms, etc., before they get in the field. And where we have a multi-function complex where that particular venue becomes a place for entertainment for shows and things. So once again, those performers need to be able to access the stage, for instance, and not just the field. So, and we engage them, different people at different times, in order to ask them for the views and comments on the designs, and where the designers, architects have perhaps forgot about that, or they need to be reminded to do more on these things. So I think the various levels we can work on depending on type of buildings, and I think it's a complex issue where it is very much as a matrix of interfaces, interventions, and basically the more formal one is to set up committees, more formal committees to look at and monitor and review various stages of the construction of these projects in order to have the best input and best facilities built at the end. So thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Please, Colette, go ahead and share with us your experience on this, please.
Sure. Thank you, Lourdes. I think if people didn't know any better, they'd say that all 3 of us work together. Or in fact, we're like polar opposite sides of the planet. But I think it just is a testament to the quality of work that comes out from a certain level of certification and accreditation. Because, so Subhash had mentioned the importance of sensitization from working with people with disabilities. So that is one very important aspect of working with stakeholder groups, is that it brings the reality of people who are differently able to the face of people who are working on the project. Because we often hear, why should I be making my sidewalks accessible? I never see anyone in a wheelchair on my sidewalk. I've never seen anyone in a wheelchair use my bus service. I've never seen someone who's blind try and cross the road. So it's like they're not there because it's inaccessible. It's not, it's not the other way around. So build it and they will come, essentially. But I think people always want to see the proof that people are differently abled. And so those stakeholder groupings are a real benefit to that. So from my side, there's a difference between accessibility compliance and user experience, and neither can effectively contribute to equality without the other. So good practices in South Africa would include, like others had mentioned, stakeholder groupings, which represent what we refer to as universal access beneficiaries. So it's much broader than just people with disabilities. I like the groups of informants to consist of representatives from organizations of and for people with disabilities, but also to include stakeholders such as people from the local schools, universities, homes of the elderly, clinics, anything else within that area that can contribute their experience to the larger group. And it's important that the stakeholder grouping consists of diverse users, because users' experience is personal. And although people can have empathy for people who are differently able to them, individual experience is what makes for a rich discussion. So we can go, yeah, I understand, from somebody who's blind, I can probably understand that. But until you meet someone and see how they navigate through the site, how they experience your service or your product, it doesn't really sink in the way it does when you meet it face to face. So in reality, Joseph had mentioned the topic on political will. And I also wanted to touch on that. It was one of the best practices here. So what we're doing is we've used an avenue to get into local government through transport. So there's a national funded program to make transport accessible, but we kind of boxed within our space. We can only work in transport. But so what we've done is we've created a working group which consists of local authority members. So everyone from different departments comes to these meetings every 2 months. We have them, and we discuss concepts of universal access openly so that there's no barrier to entry. They can bring their concerns there, we discuss it. And through transport, we've now been able to infiltrate various departments within the government where previously they would have blocked us off because it's not something that they find attractive or interesting, irrespective of human rights laws and legislation. So it's about getting that buy-in and an understanding and helping people to not be afraid to speak about what it means to design for people with disabilities, and also the concept of universal access.
Thanks, Colette. I am learning so much from you. It's really thankful again for being here today. I have a couple of more questions from the audience. One is for Joseph or Anne or Subhash. We would like to listen from you. What do you think about the confrontation between architectural heritage and accessibility? So please raise your hand, the one who would like to answer these questions about the confrontation between architectural and accessibility, right? The architectural heritage and accessibility.
The confrontational, very quickly. Confrontation, that's an interesting one. Confrontation, yes, they invariably can have confrontations when the two sides don't see the common goal, I think. It's not necessary to become, to be on opposite. Architecture heritage, accessibility can fit in quite well. I think the crux of the matter is both sides are not seeing the commonality. I think finding that middle ground, it's where it works. Accessibility can look great in a heritage building, provided it's done sensitively and work with the right professional groups and right people consulting with the user groups. This is what you want, and rather than going the other way of saying I want to do something, a beautiful museum, or you can't touch this because it's heritage and things. I think there's a middle ground that we can choose in order that can compromise and still get the best solution. Very quick answer for that one. Subhash, you have additions to that?
Yeah, thanks. I think you did cover that, and I also did cover initially that we started our work, we had huge confrontations because they would say, "What do you know about conservation?" And to which we would say, yes, we don't know, but we know about accessibility. We know why it's so important. And finally, they had to understand that yes, without accessibility, conservations are only something which is in isolation. It doesn't help if people can't visit it, and that accessibility can be done aesthetically and without disturbing the heritage or the character of heritage. That can absolutely be done. So it has not to be, in a nutshell, it shouldn't be accessibility versus conservation, but accessibility and conservation together serving a common goal.
If I might just quickly mention that the importance of providing sensitivity is important, whether it's the quality of the experience. I mean, doing a ramp can be quite intrusive and can be look out of place, but if you do it nicely, it can be just blend into the system, and you're just walking through or traveling through without actually thinking you're on a ramp or just overcoming the level differences. So I've seen good examples. I've seen a lot of bad examples. So that's where we, maybe professionals, we need to be more sensitive. And even as access consultants, what is good design and what is not so good design, I think. Thank you.
I can just jump in. If I just want to just jump in here to share my good experiences. The accessibility efforts that we conducted here in India, the Archaeological Survey of India was so thankful, and for one very reason. They said the ramps that we created for accessibility have helped us in conservation, because now most of the people are following the access routes through the ramps rather than going and scribbling on the walls and doing all those nonsense, students doing nonsense. So people have become more disciplined. People are following the access route because now there is something to see. And this is really helping in conservation. Accessibility is helping conservation was, one comment that came from the Archaeological Survey of India. And we were amazed to listen to that. It really helped.
Right, thanks for that comment as well, because it is, I think, that way, right? That accessibility is helping everywhere. It's not a confrontation, right? I think accessibility is the best friend for everyone, but we need to understand why and from where to start, right? And this is something that is missing, of course, is education, right? And that's why we have been talking and promoting to get certification, because in that way you start learning more about this topic. And Colette, there is another question from the audience for you. If you could share with us, is it considered feasible to apply accessibility regulations in a country like yours?
Thanks, Lourdes. I think, so one of the things I wanted to touch on while I answer that question is this concept of standards and things that are developed for people who use wheelchairs. And I think our building regulations were developed in 1985, was the first draft we had. And they were only revised in 2010 for FIFA World Cup that came here. And so our building regulations are very outdated. And our 2011 version also was mainly based on people with physical disabilities. And so we're only revising them now. So our standards, even though we've been complying, have been less than desirable. But in terms of whether it's feasible, we had the privilege years and years ago of working as part of a stadium design. So one of the stadiums we're going to go up, they designed it without compliance with even our minimum building regulations. During the approval stages of the plans, the project manager was in a car accident and ended up being a wheelchair user. And then the project had to become accessible. So now the whole thing had gone through costing, through finance, through procurement, through everything already. So we had a chance to compare the feasibility of applying universal access to the same project before and after scenario. The cost difference was a 0.01% cost between having an inaccessible building and having an accessible building. And so the feasibility only becomes a problem when it's a retrofit. But it's the same with anything. If you're going to retrofit anything, it's not going to be beautiful. It's going to cost you more, whether you're retrofitting for accessibility or any other purpose. And I think that that's the biggest problem, is that people think, designing for UA and universal accessibility is costly and it's ugly, but that's because it's a retrofit and not because it's been designed that way from the beginning. So in order to eliminate cost implications and things that look like they belong only in a specific section in a hospital, we need to do it from the beginning. And it's not an afterthought, and it's with stakeholders, and it's with buy-in and sensitivity training. So everybody understands the reason why we're doing it. So once you have that, you can't justify any inaction to take accessibility seriously if people understand why, even if costs are involved. It's a right, but if we did it from the beginning, the costs are not even a factor.
Thanks, Colette. That's also very important, right? To be aware that the cost for building since the beginning is almost the same, that retrofitting the building. And your intervention leads me to our last question, and I will leave any of you who would like to answer that. But what do you think about including accessibility at that elementary school? At what age should be starting to talk about accessibility? What do you think? At 5 years old, 7 years old?
Lovely. I think if I just quickly jump in and sort of sharing, there is no age. Right from the very childhood, in the nursery class, if the child is studying with his counterparts with disabilities, they learn to appreciate. So I think inclusion starts right there. You don't need the training. Mere putting children together, non-disabled and disabled, the sensitization automatically sets in. So in India, what we have done is a great thing is that sign language is introduced from the pre-primary level. So the moment the child is in the school, the child is learning sign language. So these are small interventions. By putting children together, there are a lot of this sensitization happens. You don't need to teach them very formal way. They learn how you provide inclusion efforts in the schools.
Thanks, Subhash. Joseph, Colette?
Colette first, maybe. Go ahead, Colette.
Thanks, Joseph. I think based on exactly what Subhash had said, I think, I don't know if it was like that in a lot of the other countries, but when I was in pre-primary school, if you wrote with your left hand, you were different. Everybody had to write with their right hand. And slowly those things had changed. And now it doesn't matter. Nobody questions whether you're left-handed or right-handed anymore. And I think it's exactly the same with sensitivity training in terms of people with disabilities. If children mingle from a young age, if there's no segregation between who's able to do certain things and who's not able, children stop thinking that other children are different. And they accept that from a very young age already. And we still see it now. There are young children who would stare at people who are blind or stare at people who use wheelchairs because they're not sensitized. And so it's not that they're afraid, it's that people are different and they've never seen that before. And that is a fundamental problem in society. If our people are not integrated and we're always going to see somebody else as being different, and then how it becomes really difficult to achieve a holistic and inclusive society that's based on equality.
Very quickly, I think all that I agree with. I think one element is probably once again go back into the education system. I think I know it's not going to be easy, but we can mainstream education. I know there will always be maybe special schools, maybe really, but we can have that special school as an element of the mainstream school. Then children are much more sensitized or are aware of other children who are different. Whatever ability or disability they have, and I think the education comes into very, very early on. You put the children together. And going back to the example, if within a family, the grandmother is using a walking stick or using a walking frame and a wheelchair, then that young person, that young child will see that's nothing different, nothing unusual. So that process has to come in. So maybe we need to spread them more. Maybe we need to bring, whether it's primary school or kindergartens, to make them more aware, expose them to various diversity of life. And maybe that's where it comes into, getting them sensitized and be more sensitive about other people who are maybe different, not stare and whatever, make fun of other children, etc. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Well, thanks all. Really has been really interesting, lots of topics. I need this discussion could go and go for hours, and I hope the audience will learn from this, because what we are looking here, we all, is to spread the word around accessibility, right? That accessibility is a benefit for all. So again, thanks to ONCE Foundation, we are really glad to be here. Gracias nuevamente por la invitación a la Fundación ONCE. Estamos muy contentos de haber estado hoy con ustedes.
Very happy to be here sharing this with all of you. So thanks very much. So thank you for everyone. So accessibility is an investment, not a cost, and everyone can, so that everyone can access these places. So it's important that all professionals that are involved with constructed architecture need to participate so that no one is left behind.